Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today I'm going to be discussing full sustainability and oxygen not included. Full sustainability basically means that your critical resources required to run your base and keep your duplicants alive are able to be replenished either automatically or by the labor of your duplicants without any of your direct intervention. In this video, I'm going to discuss what is needed for full sustainability in general, and then give you examples of the ingredients and processes that go over full sustainability in the easiest possible way. As you already know, each asteroid and each colony that you start in oxygen not included is going to be vastly different than the one that you've played before. So this makes the discussion of full sustainability very vague in general. You're not going to come across water geysers or cool steam vents or water sources in general as quickly in some asteroids as you are going to in others. But the end goal for reaching full sustainability is the same. Not all asteroids are going to have all of the resources needed that I'm going to discuss in this video, so you'll have to improvise depending on what is available to you and how soon you're able to find the availability of the resources that you need. So keep this in mind for the duration of this video. You should treat this video more of a foundation for the knowledge that you need for full sustainability and not as a direct blueprint. However, if you do need more in-depth examples of the concepts that I'm going to be talking about, I will link it throughout the video in the top right corner above. I have plenty of videos on my channel that explain the majority of the concepts and requirements that we're going to be glossing over in this video. But be sure to check out all the other videos if there's a particular area that you want more explanation for. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's dive right into the video and discuss full sustainability. So for starters, full sustainability is going to mean that you're supplying your duplicants with all of the requirements so they can live forever. So if we take a look at any duplicant, the game tells us exactly what we need in order to keep them alive. They're going to need 100 grams of oxygen per second. They're going to need a place to dump their carbon dioxide once they have used up the oxygen that they're inhaling. They're going to need to satisfy their hunger. They're going to need to periodically empty their bladder. And finally, they're going to need to maintain a steady body temperature so they don't get too cold or too hot. Obviously, this is a very quick rundown. Let's take a look at each criteria in depth. First of all, we're going to need oxygen. You're going to be able to produce oxygen in one of three ways. Now, of course, you can use anything from the oxygen tab, but not everything is going to be sustainable long-term without intervention. For example, you're most likely going to start your game with the oxygen diffuser. But the oxygen diffuser not only has a power requirement, but it also has an algae requirement of 550 grams per second. If you made it far enough into the game, you know that algae is a finite resource, and that you're not going to be able to find it forever on your asteroid. There's also no such thing as an algae vent or an algae geyser where you can find algae in order to sustain your usage of the oxygen diffuser. The oxygen diffuser is purely something that you use in the beginning of your playthrough in order to support your duplicants until you transition to something that is actually fully sustainable. Now you might be saying, hey Ethan, what about the algae distiller? The algae distiller can produce algae using slime. So why can't I just use slime to produce algae to keep feeding into the oxygen diffuser? And this is a perfectly valid point. You can indeed refine slime into algae using the distiller. However, now you have another requirement that you need to fulfill in order to produce oxygen. As with anything in the game, you're going to start layering these requirements on top of each other until you get to the very raw material that you need in order to sustain your duplicants. So if we keep going the algae route, now we're going to have to find a way to sustain our slime production. So we can click on slime, and the game will tell us exactly how to produce or find slime. Now again, slime is a finite resource on your asteroid. You're not going to be able to find an infinite source of slime. So if we scroll down and see what slime is produced by, it's produced by only puffed. Upon consuming polluted oxygen, the puff is going to produce 47.5 kilograms of slime per cycle, which can then be refined into algae and then fed to your algae diffuser. However, going this route, we just unlocked another requirement that's needed, and that is polluted oxygen. So now we click on polluted oxygen, and now we have to find out what produces polluted oxygen. Well, polluted dirt does that, polluted water also does that, but these are both very inefficient methods and not very effective in general. So we can keep going even further down. What else produces polluted oxygen? Well, we have the morbs. If you've ever forgotten to empty your outhouses at the start of your game, you know that you can produce morbs, which are going to produce polluted oxygen. And these guys don't need to be fed. The only requirement for these guys to produce polluted oxygen is to simply be able to run around back and forth, and they will occasionally produce polluted oxygen, which then you could feed into your puffed, or filter directly using deodorizers to turn into clean oxygen, which can bypass your algae diffuser step altogether. So you can see that trying to find a way to produce algae can be very complicated and very costly, and almost not worth the effort. There's just way too much that can go wrong. Oh, and we completely forgot to talk about the deodorizer. The deodorizer is not going to run forever either. It's going to need a filtration medium, such as sand, in order to continue to use it indefinitely. So there we go, another requirement to sustain your algae production in order to produce oxygen. So there's gotta be an easier way. And of course, that easier way is the electrolyzer. The electrolyzer needs 1000 grams per second of water in order to produce oxygen and hydrogen gas, and it only needs 120 watts of power to do so. Now by now, you've probably heard of the full Rodriguez SPOM or the HydroSPOM, and both of these are going to produce oxygen and hydrogen for you by using water, and they're going to be able to sustain themselves, hence the name, the SPOM, self-powered oxygen maker. Since the only requirement for the electrolyzer is water, it is very easy to sustain, and you can usually find plenty of different water sources on your asteroid, such as the water geyser, or the cool steam vent, or something along those lines that you can tame and collect the resources that you can pump directly into the electrolyzer in order to produce your oxygen and hydrogen. Of course, going this method, you're going to need to separate the two gases, and that's going to cost you power. And we'll get to power later in the video. But the requirements for running an electrolyzer, whether it's in a full Rodriguez configuration or a Hydro configuration, is going to be a lot more user-friendly than trying to produce algae by producing slime, by having a puff farm, and by using morbs. By eliminating all those layers of complexity and all those layers of failure, you're going to get something that essentially works forever and could even power itself. Because the electrolyzer is so easy to use, I find that oxygen is the easiest requirement that you can fulfill in order to sustain your duplicants. And it's very easy to scale it up as long as you have the water sources nearby or elsewhere on your asteroid that you can pump over in order to supply your electrolyzers. Now, of course, one of the downsides of using the electrolyzer is that the temperature of the oxygen is going to be very hot. In this case, this Hydra is making oxygen at 67 degrees Celsius. And this is just going to be way too hot to pump into your base. Now, there are different configurations that you can have for your base. Perhaps you have different requirements depending on how you choose to make your asteroid fully sustainable. But because we're going to use the easiest method possible and the least complex method, I'm going to focus on plants and critters that are very sensitive to temperature. This 67-degree oxygen is no good for our base. We have to cool it down. In order to do this, we need a steam turbine aqua tuner combo, and this is going to require a significant amount of power, and usually this power requirement is going to put you over the positive threshold that the SPOM would normally be able to produce on its own. I'm using this aqua tuner, which takes 1200 watts of power, in order to keep the oxygen cool before I send it off to my base. So this oxygen gets pumped into my base at roughly 12 degrees Celsius at various stages using high-pressure gas vents. Although this may seem very cold, don't forget that I have a lot of heat-producing equipment within my base, so this is going to help balance out the overall temperature requirements. But we're getting a little bit too far ahead of ourselves. We just started discussing food, temperature, and power. And those three just so happen to be the other requirements for a fully sustainable base. So let's move on to food. Oxygen Not Included has a whole variety of foods that you can choose from that you can feed to your duplicants. Using the electric grill, you can make anything from omelets, fried mushrooms, barbecue, cooked seafood, and so on. And the only other thing that you need is power besides the ingredients of the foods that you're trying to cook. If you're using the gas range, this adds another layer of complexity. So we're not going to explore a fully sustainable base with the gas range, although keep in mind that if you want to support your duplicants with something that's made from the gas range, the only other requirement that you're going to need other than the ingredients is going to be natural gas. So like I said in the beginning of this video, each asteroid is going to be different, and they're all going to have their positives and negatives. If you have a close by natural gas geyser that you would like to use for your gas range, you can definitely use it to fully sustain your dupes using the gas range. But we're going to focus on the most simple concepts possible. And in this case, I'm going to go with the bristleberry. The bristleberry, which you can get by harvesting the bristle blossom plants, these need two separate requirements on their own. Aside from the basics such as air pressure, atmosphere, and body temperature, which we're also going to get to later, you're going to need illumination via the ceiling lights at the very top, and 20 kilograms of water per cycle. 20 kilograms of water per cycle seems like a lot, but when you start to tame multiple sources of water, such as the water geyser and the cool steam vent, you're going to have plenty of water on your asteroid in order to have bristle blossoms available. And if you're already on electrolyzers, chances are you already have a source of water, because it would be unwise to go to your electrolyzer if you don't have a fully sustainable source yet. So that's why I chose bristle blossoms. It's something that can be easily paired with the electrolyzer with just one water source. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about mealwood? This doesn't need any power at all. Well, you're right, but mealwood has another requirement in the form of 10 kilograms of dirt per cycle. And dirt is also not a fully renewable resource, as there are no geysers or vents that can produce the dirt. Of course, you could produce the dirt using other means, such as heating up other materials like algae, fertilizer, and so on, that will turn it directly into dirt. And of course, there are things like the plant pulverizer, the sludge press, and the compost that will produce dirt for you. But these all require an extra step or an extra ingredient, and that's what we're trying to avoid altogether. That's not to say that you can't use these techniques, but in my opinion, the simplest form of fully sustainable food production is going to be the gristleberry. On this asteroid, I'm feeding my duplicants primarily the stuffed berry, so I'm not only using the gristleberry from the electric grill, but I'm also using pincher pepper plants. So just for fun, let's take a look at what I'm doing on this sandbox asteroid in order to fully sustain the pincher pepper plant production. You can see just how much complexity we've added by adding another ingredient. First of all, the pincher pepper plant requirements are a lot more extreme than just the bristle blossoms. We're going to need a temperature range between 35 and 85 degrees Celsius, and this is very significant to the temperatures that we're trying to maintain throughout the rest of our base. This is very hot in contrast to what the bristle blossoms require. We're also going to need 35 kilograms per cycle of polluted water, which is also very hard to come by if you haven't found a geyser that produces polluted water. Of course, there are geysers that produce polluted water, so this is definitely something that you can sustain long term. The final thing is going to be fertilization, and you're going to need 1,000 grams per cycle of phosphorite. Phosphorite is another ingredient that you're going to have to produce elsewhere because it's a finite resource on your asteroid. Luckily for you, it's fairly easy and common to produce a lot of phosphorite, especially if you're going to be using the steam turbine aqua tuner combo, which is going to require plastic. There are two main ways to produce plastic and oxygen not included. The first is the polymer press, and the second is glossy Drecos. It is very common to farm glossy Drecos in order to produce plastic. And if you're going to be farming glossy Drecos, chances are you're going to make plenty of phosphorite in order to produce the pincher pepper plant. And guess what? Glossy Drecos also have something in common with everything that we've already talked about thus far, and that is that they feed off bristle blossoms. So just by having a sustainable source of water, not only can you produce oxygen, food for your duplicants, but you can also have a sustained plastic production by feeding glossy Drecos bristle blossoms, which then in turn can also produce phosphorite to make pincher pepper plants, which then you can use in combination with the gristleberry in order to produce stuffed berry for an increased morale boost for your duplicants. The only thing that's left from this web of ingredients is going to be the polluted water in order to irrigate the pincher pepper plants. So you can see how everything kind of starts to work together and oxygen not included. The more requirements that you start to add together, the greater the taxes are in order to sustain your duplicants. And, just for the record, having a high morale is not necessary to produce a fully sustainable colony, although it is going to help. Now, there are four main ways to regulate the temperatures of your base. The very first is going to be insulating your base as soon as you start to expand into warmer biomes. The absolute best way to manage the heat and oxygen not included is to not allow it to creep in altogether. So, if you're starting to expand your base and dig into areas that are very hot, make sure you start insulating and blocking that area off with something like a liquid lock to prevent the heat transfer from happening in the atmosphere. Of course, the liquid lock in and of itself is not a 100% way to block heat transfer, so you're going to have to use vacuums as well. And this is explained in my liquid lock tutorial guide. The second one is going to be regulating your water sources if you're using water for crops, or regulating your solid material temperatures if you're feeding solid material to critters. And this can apply to something like igneous rock that is produced by a volcano that you're feeding to hatches. I'm going to focus a lot on bristle blossoms in this video, but you can definitely use a hatch farm in order to sustain your colony using barbecue. Of course, hatch farms are also going to need an infinite source of food, and most rocks on your asteroid are going to be a finite source. So this is where volcanoes come in. If you choose to have barbecue as your main source of food, you can definitely use a hatch farm, and that would be preferably a stone hatch farm, because you can indefinitely sustain them using igneous rock from a volcano. However, a volcano is going to be more complex than the bristle blossoms, so I'm not going to spend too much time focused on that. But just remember to always look at the requirements tab of anything that you're trying to source, such as igneous rock, and make sure that it can come from a fully sustainable resource. Nonetheless, if you're feeding this igneous rock into your base, you're going to want to make sure that it's the appropriate temperature, because if it's coming directly from a volcano after it solidifies from magma, it's going to be extremely hot and probably break everything in your base once it starts to heat it up. Don't forget that magma solidifies into igneous rock at 1400 degrees Celsius. This is incredibly hot, and it's going to heat up your base so much that your duplicants are eventually not going to be able to live. Also keep in mind that the livable range of hatches is 100 degrees Celsius. So if you're feeding in all of the solid material that is 1400 degrees, it's going to heat up your base so much over time that your hatches and your duplicants are going to perish due to the temperatures. So you're going to need a way to cool the solid material before it gets introduced into your colony. And just like we'll discuss in one moment with the bristle blossoms, this can be achieved by a steam turbine aqua tuner combo, which you can find a tutorial for on my channel. A colony and oxygen not included cannot get too hot, and this is obvious, but it also cannot get too cold. Depending on your crops and critter requirements, you're going to need a way to control the temperature of your base. Because we're focused solely on the bristle blossom, a very simple way to control the body temperature of the bristle blossom is not only by pumping in very cold oxygen into the atmosphere that's coming from your spawn, but also by cooling the water that you're sending to your bristle blossoms. In this case, I'm sending 15-degree water directly into my bristle blossoms. This causes their ambient temperature to be about 15 degrees, combined with the atmospheric temperature that they're experiencing. The water that I'm pumping into my bristle blossoms also has the added bonus of cycling through my entire base, including my kitchen, which is a very major heat contributor to my base, the Great Hall, and certain other areas that help cool the ambient temperatures around the entire base. Now, this is not the most efficient cooling loop setup because this is sandbox mode, and I just kind of whipped it together. There are definitely better snaking configurations that you can make throughout your base. The point is that you're going to want to combine your operations. If you're sending cold water into your bristle blossoms, you might as well snake it around your base in order to cool it as well at the same time. This should ultimately mean less power requirements for your steam turbine and aqua tuner combo units to keep your water temperatures cool while also maintaining a low base temperature. The way I'm doing this is in a chamber of water that is connected to a liquid pipe thermosensor. This liquid pipe thermosensor will send a green signal to the liquid shutoff if the water temperature detected is less than 23 degrees. And it's just a way to control that I'm only sending cold water into my base and to my blossoms. And of course, this is being cooled by snaking using radiant liquid pipes and polluted water inside of the pipes. Finally, we're going to talk about your power requirements. Let's go back and use the bristle blossoms as an example. We already discussed temperature, we've already discussed oxygen, and we've already discussed the water. The very last thing is going to be illumination. Illumination is not very power intensive at all for your bristle blossoms. You only need to have one light, and that's going to cover multiple bristle blossoms, and that only takes 10 watts of power. But also note that it does produce some heat. If you don't have any form of heat control, this is going to excessively heat up your farm, just like we talked about earlier. But anyways, now we're focused on power. In order to get this far in oxygen not included, and run all the cooling systems that we talked about, you're going to need plenty of power, because each aqua tuner takes 1.2 kilowatts of power, and this is going to be a very large demand on your colony. Your duplicants are going to be able to do a lot of manual labor, but inevitably, in order to store something like igneous rock from a volcano, you're also going to want auto sweepers, conveyor loaders, metal refineries in order to produce the steel that's needed for the conveyor loaders and auto sweepers, and so on. Fortunately for us, our oxygen production in the form of the full Rodriguez spawn or the Hydra spawn is going to be able to fully sustain our oxygen production, and there's going to be residual hydrogen left over that we can use elsewhere in our colony if needed. But this is not going to supply all of the aqua tuners that we're going to need. In addition to this, steam turbines are not going to recapture all of the heat that the aqua tuners produce, although they're definitely going to add a small bonus into your overall power network. So what we're going to need to do is find us a fully sustainable way to produce power long term, and that's mainly going to come one of three ways or a combination of all three, starting with the hydrogen vent, natural gas production, or our petroleum generators. All three of these are perfectly viable on their own or in a combination with one another to sustain all of the power that you're going to need for your asteroid. Obviously, hydrogen vents also need to be tamed, and you can find a video on this on my channel. Natural gas geysers arguably are the easiest to tame because to withstand their temperature requirements is not all that hard. Petroleum is a little bit more complicated, so let's go down to the very bottom of the asteroid and take a look at how that's dealt with. In this case, we're using an oil well on top of an oil reservoir, and this is going to produce an indefinite source of natural gas and oil for us, as long as we're supplying it with none other than water. And in this case, the water shut off, but water would usually be coming down these pipes. The oil reservoirs are an excellent source of oil production for power purposes because they never go dormant. As long as you have water supplied to your oil well, you're going to be able to produce as much oil as you possibly can for all the power that you need. And petroleum generators just happen to be one of the best ways to produce power. They're going to give you 2 kilowatts of power for each petroleum generator built. For comparison, one natural gas generator only gives you 800 watts, and one hydrogen generator only gives you 800 watts as well. Now, of course, you may have more than one source of hydrogen vent on your asteroid, and you may have multiple sources of natural gas geysers on your asteroid as well. So it may be beneficial to stay on these methods instead of going for petroleum, because that's going to eat up a lot of your water requirements that you need for bristle blossoms and oxygen production. So if you made it this far into the game where you're considering using water to produce oil in order to produce petroleum, You've probably already figured out if you're producing more than enough water for your previous requirements than you need. And if the answer is yes, then you can definitely go to petroleum and start producing insane amounts of power with the petroleum generator. You could go ahead and do some math and add up all the requirements for water that you have throughout your entire asteroid, but for me, the easiest way possible is just to keep an eye on your water levels in your water reservoirs. If you have an infinite storage method for storing your water, then you can use a hydro sensor attached to an automated notifier by automation that can let you know if your water levels are getting too low and you need to cut something off. Alternatively, if you're not using an infinite storage solution, just keep an eye on your water levels and make sure that they're not getting too low. Or have multiple hydro sensors that activate multiple pumps depending on your water levels in that reservoir. And you can do the same for an infinite storage solution as well. However you decide to manage your water is up to you, and whatever you choose to use it for is also up to you, but it should definitely be determined by the amount of water that you're able to recapture from all the other sources available on your asteroid. Each asteroid and each colony is going to be vastly different than the ones that you played before. They're all going to be the same basic concept, and you're going to use the same foundational knowledge in order to get yourself far into the game. But what you can build on the asteroid is going to be heavily dictated by the requirements and the availability of the resources that you're trying to use. My best advice that I can give you for power production and oxygen not included is to have multiple different sources at the ready so you can never run out of power. This is very easy to control with smart batteries. As you probably already know, smart batteries can have a high and low threshold to control the generators that they're attached to via automation, and this can dictate what sources of power you're drawing from first. For example, this smart battery has a high threshold of 90% and a low threshold of 40%. The smart battery right beside it has a high threshold of 90 and a low threshold of 80. That means that the smart battery with a low threshold of 40 will almost never turn on as long as the smart battery with a low threshold of 80 is able to sustain that level of charge. And in this case, I have the one with the 80 low threshold attached to my natural gas generators, and the one with the 40 low threshold attached to these petroleum generators. So I'm prioritizing the use of the natural gas generator unless the charge gets low enough where I feel the need to start petroleum generators up. And the very bottom one that I have connected to the hydrogen generators is set to 85. So I'm prioritizing this one above all else, including the natural gas generator. So if you don't have a lot of water, you don't necessarily have to run the petroleum generators, and you don't necessarily have to keep producing crude oil. You can have everything automated together, and automation wires are a one-time cost to creating a fully sustainable asteroid, so it's well worth the investment. So those are the 4 major requirements that you're going to need to fully sustain your asteroid and your colony, and oxygen not included. Let's talk about some of the other byproducts of having duplicants alive. These aren't necessarily fully sustainable requirements. For example, you don't technically need a washroom for your duplicants. They can survive just fine by peeing all over the floor and into your clean water supply, although it's not a good idea for them to do that. So washrooms are sort of a luxury that you want to provide so they're not creating a mess all over the bottom of your asteroid. Now, of course, you could have fresh water plumbed into the washrooms non-stop, but one of the easiest ways to manage water production early on is to have a fully sustainable bathroom on a loop with a water sieve and a way to get rid of the excessive amounts of polluted water that you're going to be producing from the washrooms. So if you don't know, your washrooms are always going to produce more polluted water than the clean water that they're consuming. So you can put this on an infinite loop where the polluted water is going directly into a water sieve that simply reconnects to the inlet of the showers, lavatories, and sinks that your duplicants use. The excessive polluted water can either be stored into a liquid reservoir to be cleaned later on, or fed into something like a thimble reed plant, which then you can use to produce reed fibers. You can also use the extra polluted water to send into your pincher pepper plant farm as long as you clean it first with chlorine. What you decide to do with it is up to you. Just remember that the water sieve in itself creates a new tax on your colony because it's going to need a filtration method using sand. The lesson here is that any building that you create, you should click on and look at the requirements and find out if there are any finite resources that it requires that you cannot reproduce long term. Also, at the beginning of the video, we discussed that your duplicants are going to be producing a lot of carbon dioxide throughout your playthrough. And of course, for this, you need a carbon skimmer. The carbon skimmer once again requires water. Luckily for us, it's going to produce polluted water, which we can then use for something like pincher pepper plants. Or send them back into a water sieve, which just gets dropped back into our clean water supply. If you don't have the water to sustain a carbon skimmer, you can simply put that on its own infinite loop just like the water in the washrooms, or you can dump your carbon dioxide into outer space by sucking it up and vacuuming it out into outer space. Now, when we combine everything that we just talked about, such as oxygen production, cooling, food production, and carbon dioxide production from your duplicants, this is all going to come back to how many duplicants you have in your asteroid. Obviously, it makes sense to have enough duplicants that you can get a lot of things done quickly. For example, you want to definitely have a dedicated cook, a dedicated farmer, a dedicated rancher, and a dedicated operator depending on what tasks you have around your base. And you probably want a handful of laborers in order to do the task that everyone else is unable to do because they have a specialized skill. So how many duplicants that you like to play with is completely up to you, but just remember that each duplicant adds a tax in the form of oxygen production, food production, and carbon dioxide deletion that you're going to have to fulfill. So one of the easiest ways to mitigate all this is to just not take on too many duplicants to begin with. For instance, if your colony keeps failing because you're running out of algae too quickly in your playthroughs before you're able to transfer into electrolyzers, don't take on so many duplicants early on. Then, that algae is going to be able to sustain that oxygen production a lot longer because you have less duplicants that you're feeding oxygen to. And this is the same for your bristle blossoms. If you're exclusively on bristle blossoms, then you're going to use significantly less water if you have less duplicants. There's also the question of storing your food. I have a video on the deep frozen method that I'm using to store all my food here. You can see all the berry sludge, cooked seafood, and stuffed berry that I have for my duplicants that they're able to eat. Having a deep frozen storage solution for all your food is going to require very little power, especially if you're producing that deep frozen storage using an AETN. And of course, I have a video on my channel about this as well. The only requirement that you need as far as power goes is going to be getting your hydrogen into the AETN in the first place, so you're going to need a pump, and you're going to want to keep your deep frozen chamber cold, so you're going to need a gas shutoff paired with a thermal sensor. In addition to this, of course, you're going to need a conveyor belt, so you need an auto sweeper and a conveyor loader. But these are just some of the extra little things that come with having a fully automated base. I highly encourage you to build a deep frozen chamber as it's very easy, and it's going to keep your food from spoiling altogether, which is going to greatly benefit your colony long term. And although it's not essential for full sustainability, it is definitely going to help. There's absolutely nothing wrong with keeping just the amount of food you need inside of a refrigerator. But your colony is going to be much better off, and you're also going to be able to take on much more duplicants if you have a way to store your food indefinitely so it doesn't go bad. Make sure that you remember that full sustainability is not always the end goal of a playthrough. If you're someone who hasn't got the mid-game, late game, or even end game yet, or who's never built a rocket, for example, don't worry so much about full sustainability. Worry about solving the little problems that cause your colonies to fail instead of trying to fully sustain your base. While you can definitely learn a lot by trying to strive for full sustainability, it is definitely not a requirement to finish a game, depending on what your definition of a finished game in Oxygen Not Included actually is. The most important is to learn from your mistakes that you made last time in order to get your colony farther than you did before. And finally, remember that this guide covers the most basic K requirements, and the more you expand your infrastructure, the more cooling you'll need, which increases your power requirements, and so on. Everything in the game is essentially a tax on itself until you get to the very raw materials or very raw substances that you absolutely need. With that in mind, if I missed anything critical, feel free to leave it in the comments below, or if you have any questions on full sustainability, leave that in the comments below as well. I'd love to talk to you guys about fully sustainability and what you consider to be a finished game in Oxygen Not Included. Also, if you made it all the way to the end, be sure to leave a rating on this video as this helps me out immensely in the algorithm. And be sure to subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Once again, I'd like to thank all my viewers for following me on this channel for so long. I love making these videos, and I really hope that you enjoyed this one as much as I enjoyed making it. I really hope that it was informative and it can help you succeed and get farther into the game than you've ever gotten before. I've started doing live streams recently, and I have a lot of fun doing them and interacting with the audience. So feel free to come by at my next live stream and check it out. Until next time, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you guys in the next video.